This fisherman spotted a massive fish, and his expression instantly turned serious. He tucked his money into his hat to keep it dry and jumped into the river, ready to battle the giant fish. With a flick of his wrist, he cast the line, landing the fly lure perfectly. This was Paul's own unique fly fishing technique. He gently reeled in the line, and the fish took the bait. He smoothly controlled the reel and gave a powerful swing. A huge trout burst out of the water. The fish thrashed wildly and dragged Paul into deeper water. The river swallowed him whole. In the end, the exhausted trout was hauled onto the shore by Paul. His father and brother stood on the bank in complete disbelief. Paul proudly showed off his catch to them. His brother praised him as a great fisherman, but joked that it would take at least 3 more years before he could think like a fish. He also said Paul reminded him of a dead rock. This quiet town in Montana sat along the banks of the big Blackfoot River. The family of 4 consisted of a minister father and a homemaker mother. The older son, Norman, was gentle and loved literature. The younger son, Paul, was wild and free-spirited, and even challenged his father over a bowl of cereal. He was the family's little troublemaker. Every week, the family attended church to listen to their father's sermons. Besides being a minister, he was also one of the area's best fly fishermen. He taught both of his sons how to fish. Fly fishing required rhythm and precision, using artificial flies to attract fish. Norman and Paul became fascinated with it from an early age and often practiced by the river. Norman hoped to become a minister. Paul dreamed of becoming a professional fisherman. In 1917, America entered World War I. Most of the healthy lumber workers in town enlisted. 16-year-old Norman was too young to join and began working for the Forest Service. Paul was even younger and worked as a lifeguard while practicing fly fishing at night. Their father's life never changed. One evening, Paul suggested rafting through the rapids. The next day, they borrowed a boat and headed upstream. The sight of the rushing water scared everyone, except Paul. Norman reluctantly joined him. The boat bounced violently through the rapids and plunged over a waterfall. Their friends rushed downstream and found only the wrecked boat. The brothers were nowhere to be seen. As everyone panicked, Paul suddenly appeared from behind a tree and shoved one of them into the river. The group burst into laughter and roughhousing. Norman sat alone on a hillside, feeling strangely empty. When they got home, their father scolded them. Paul took all the blame and said it had been his idea. At dinner, Paul was still excited while Norman remained quiet. Paul dropped sardines onto Norman's plate even though he hated them. Their mother stepped in. The brothers got into the only fistfight of their lives, but it never damaged their bond. Soon enough, they were back at the river, fishing with their father. The 3 of them cast their lines together. This time, Paul ignored his father's instructions and created a rhythm entirely his own. He called it the shadow cast. The line seemed to come alive in his hands. Paul caught fish much larger than Norman's. Even so, their father remained the better fisherman. Norman was accepted into college and left for a school nearly 2,000 miles away. The family said their goodbyes. Paul chased the train until it disappeared from sight. Over the next 6 years, Norman spent most of his time at college and rarely came home. Paul attended a nearby university and later became a newspaper reporter in the city. He also gained a reputation as an exceptional fisherman. When Norman finally returned home 6 years later, he realized he had grown distant from his parents. His father was still strict. He pulled Norman into his study and questioned him about his future. Had he taught classes? Did he believe teaching was his true calling? Their mother stepped in just in time and ended the uncomfortable conversation. Norman visited Paul at the newspaper office. After years apart, things felt awkward at first. Soon they found their old rhythm and went fishing on the river together. Norman's fly fishing skills had become rusty. Paul tried to help but only made things worse and eventually walked away. Norman regained his touch and landed a large fish. Meanwhile, Paul's self-invented casting method had turned him into a true master. Paul invited some childhood friends to welcome Norman home. Everyone shared stories and laughter. Then Paul suddenly left for the casino. At a party, Norman met Jessie and fell in love at first sight. The next day, he called her and asked her out. Touched by his sincerity, she agreed. Later, they ran into Paul and his Native American girlfriend at a bar. At the time, many people looked down on Native Americans, but Paul did not care. When someone insulted his girlfriend, Paul punched him and ended up in jail. There, Norman learned that Paul was a regular gambler with heavy debts. Norman offered to help. Paul immediately refused and insisted on dealing with the consequences himself. The entire family knew about his gambling problem. No one wanted to talk about it. Norman wrote Jessie a heartfelt love letter. She was deeply moved. Soon her cousin Neil returned from California, and Jessie brought Norman to meet him. Neil loved bragging about himself. Norman disliked him immediately. Jessie's family arranged a fishing trip for them, but Neil preferred going to bars. That night, Norman accompanied him and reminded him not to miss the fishing trip the next morning. Norman invited Paul to join him for fishing. The brothers arrived at the river early. Neil never showed up. Eventually he appeared drunk with a woman from the bar. To the brothers, fishing was something sacred. They refused to bring him along. Afterward, they found him asleep in the scorching sun with a severe sunburn. Norman drove Neil back to Jesse's house. Jessie complained that he had not taken her cousin fishing. Even so, she drove Norman home. Along the way, floodwater covered the road. Jessie boldly drove onto railroad tracks and through a tunnel. Norman was nervous. Jessie loved every second of it. As the sun set, Norman confessed his feelings for her. Jessie did not answer directly, but in her heart, she had already chosen him. That night, Paul returned home. The family sat down for dinner. Paul forced a smile and entertained everyone with amusing stories. When his mother tried to expose his act, he immediately stood up and left. A week later, Neil departed. Norman went to the station to see him off. Norman and Jessie walked through the woods together. Jessie remarked that Neil was as stubborn as Paul and refused to accept help. Norman pulled out a letter from the University of Chicago. He had been offered a position and was about to become a real English professor. He said he did not want to leave because he did not want to leave her. Jessie threw herself into his arms. The two finally confessed their love. Norman went to a bar to share the news with Paul. Paul joked that a man should not give up an entire lake for a single fish. But after hearing Norman's determination, he sincerely wished him happiness. After a few drinks, the brothers headed home. On the way, Paul took Norman to his favorite casino, Lulu's. Because of his debts, Paul was no longer allowed to gamble there. Norman dragged him outside. Paul insisted his luck was about to change. Norman told him he could not keep doing this. He was drowning in debt. Paul replied that they were his debts and his life. Disappointed, Norman got into his car to leave. Paul ran after him and said they might never get another chance to fish together. He wanted one last trip to the river with their father. Then he turned around and walked back toward the casino without looking back. The next morning, Paul returned home safely. Norman told his parents about the University of Chicago offer. They were proud of him. After breakfast, the three men headed to the river once more. Norman caught several fish. Paul could not settle his mind and caught nothing. Norman handed him a fly and mentioned that he planned to propose to Jessie on Friday. He invited Paul to come to Chicago and start over. Paul refused. He loved the mountains, the river, and the life he had built there. He wanted to stay. Their father no longer had the strength to cast a line. He sat quietly on the bank. Then Paul hooked the biggest fish of his life. Norman snapped a photograph. As the sun set, the three shared one perfect afternoon together. The day before Norman left for Chicago, Paul was beaten to death with a gun stock and left in a dark alley. The right hand that once danced across the fishing line was shattered. The family was devastated. Their father seemed to age overnight. To him, Paul had always been perfect. Shortly before his death, their father delivered his final sermon. He said, "We rarely succeed in helping the people closest to us. Either we do not know which part of ourselves to give, or what we offer is not what they need. That is why the people we should understand best often drift furthest away. Yet we can still love them. We can love them completely."